The quiet suburbs were home to many families, and among them was the simple, unremarkable family of the Khans. The house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, its yellowed exterior and overgrown garden offering little more than a glimpse of a once thriving home. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, where the rhythm of life flowed like clockwork, and the boundaries between strangers and neighbors blurred. Every morning, the father-in-law, Mr. Akhtar Khan, could be seen walking to the small garden that bordered the front of the house, inspecting the plants as if they were the only things that mattered. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical, as he checked off his daily ritual with a sigh, then disappeared inside to begin his day. His daughter-in-law, Sana, was in her late 20s, and had been married to his son, Zain, for 4 years. She was the type of woman who blended into the background, a quiet beauty with an elegance that made her stand out, though she rarely drew attention to herself. Sana's life was a carefully constructed illusion of happiness. She had once been a young woman full of dreams and aspirations, but now she had become a wife and mother, absorbed in domestic life. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly normal existence, there was a deep, unspoken tension. Sana's smile often faltered when she caught her father-in-law's eye. She could feel it, the unrelenting gaze that lingered on her longer than it should. It unsettled her, though she pushed it to the back of her mind, rationalizing it as harmless attention. Zain, her husband, was a man of few words, always focused on his career, often traveling for work. He adored his wife, and made sure to provide for their family, but the emotional distance between them had grown over the years. They were two people bound together by a commitment, but the spark they once shared had long since faded. Their marriage had become a routine, void of passion, with Sana often left to care for their young daughter and manage the home. This neglect created an emptiness inside her, a longing for something more, though she didn't quite understand what. Akhtar, on the other hand, wasn't just a passive figure in their home. He had always been the patriarch, the one who gave direction and advice. He had always prided himself on being the authority, not just within his family, but in their entire circle of friends. What made him dangerous, however, was his ability to remain under the radar, to keep his darker emotions hidden beneath layers of charm and manipulation. It was this very subtlety that made Sana feel both comforted and uneasy. There were moments when his presence seemed too overwhelming, too suffocating. His gestures, his long silences, and the way his gaze would often rest on her, just a little too long, left her feeling uncomfortable in her own home. The first crack in the illusion came during a late summer evening when Sana, tired and exhausted from a long day, found herself alone in the kitchen preparing dinner. Zain had left for a business trip, and the house was eerily quiet. Akhtar had taken to sitting in his study more frequently these days, his presence lingering in the shadows, like an uninvited guest. That night, Sana felt his eyes on her again. He stood just outside the kitchen, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching her without saying a word. At first, she pretended not to notice, focusing on the chopping board in front of her, but she could feel the weight of his stare. She caught a glimpse of his reflection in the kitchen window, and saw the way his lips curled into an unsettling, unreadable smile. One afternoon, Akhtar invited Sana to join him for tea on the porch. It was the beginning of autumn, and the air was cooler. Sana, feeling the weight of her emotions, reluctantly agreed. They sat across from each other, sipping their drinks in silence. But something was different that day. There was an intensity in Akhtar's gaze, a determination that made Sana's skin crawl. "Sana," he said slowly, breaking the silence. "You've always been so good to this family. I don't know what I would have done without you." His voice was low, but it was the way he looked at her that sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to laugh it off, but he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "You know," he continued, I've always seen something special in you." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and for the first time, Sanaa felt the coldness of fear creeping into her chest. She stood up quickly, excusing herself, and retreated back into the house. But his words lingered in her mind, eating away at her. She began to see their interactions in a different light. The touching that had once seemed innocent now felt like an invasion. His constant presence in her life, once benign, now seemed suffocating. Sanaa began to seek solace in her own thoughts, retreating into the corners of her mind where she could escape the unspoken tension that had taken over her home. She started to withdraw from her father-in-law, creating distance where there had been none before. The more she resisted his advances, the more Akhtar seemed determined to push her boundaries. It wasn't long before the situation reached its breaking point. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Zayn was again away on business, Akhtar approached Sanaa while she was alone in the living room. This time, there was no pretense, no cordial words. He was desperate. He cornered her, his breath heavy with whiskey, his hands trembling. "I know you feel it too, Sanaa," he said, his voice shaking. "This connection between us. I've waited too long. You're the only one who understands me." Sanaa tried to back away, but her body collided with the wall behind her. Panic surged through her, and in that moment, everything within her snapped. The years of being trapped, of living in silence, all came crashing down. She fought back, pushing against him, struggling to escape his grip. The argument escalated, words turning into shoves, and before she knew it, Akhtar's hands were around her throat. The force of his anger was overwhelming, and Sanaa's vision blurred as she fought for breath. In the struggle, she managed to break free, but the damage had already been done. Akhtar stood there, breathless and shaking, staring at the woman he had just attacked. His mind raced as he realized what he had done. The house, once a sanctuary, had become the site of violence, of betrayal. Sanaa, her hands around her neck, struggled to stand. She was no longer just a daughter-in-law. She was a victim. But as Akhtar's guilt began to consume him, his first instinct was to cover his tracks. He quickly attempted to clean up the scene, but it was too late. The damage had been done. And though the police wouldn't be called for hours, the stain of violence had already marred the house, and the family, forever. The aftermath of the crime was a slow unraveling. Akhtar, though deeply shaken by the violence he had inflicted, tried to convince himself that it had been an accident, a moment of rage he couldn't control. But deep down, he knew what he had done. Sanaa was gone, her life slipping away as he clung to the remnants of his shattered facade. Zayn returned to the house to find it in chaos, his wife's body gone, the house drenched in guilt. At first, he didn't know what to believe. But as the pieces of the story began to emerge, so did the undeniable truth. His father had killed his wife. The community, once so eager to speak of the Khan family's respectability, now whispered only in hushed tones. The media swarmed, and the family's reputation was irreparably tarnished. What had once been a life of quiet privilege was now a tragic tale of betrayal, obsession, and murder. In the weeks and months that followed, Akhtar was arrested and charged with murder. His son, haunted by grief, was left to rebuild his shattered life. The death of his wife left a void that no amount of time could fill, and the knowledge that his own father had been responsible tore him apart. Sanaa's death served as a tragic reminder of the darker forces at play within families, and the complex dynamics of control, power, and love. The story didn't end with justice or redemption. Instead, it left behind an irreversible truth. Some families, despite their outward appearances, are far from perfect, and sometimes the darkest secrets